Michelle Marie McGrath. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Unclassified Woman. Today I'm speaking to Kristen Barnes in Melbourne, Australia. Kristen is a registered psychologist and certified life coach in private practice. She draws on her psychological training and 25 years of experience to provide counselling, her uniquely therapeutic coaching service, and supervisory skills for coaches and therapists. Kristen helps people discover, claim, and value themselves so they can carve out a passionate life of substance. She believes you're most passionate and powerful when you simply dare to be yourself. How true is that? And this was a great conversation with a very warm, caring lady who shared information about her 20 years of experience with trying for IVF and the way she used her mothering and nurturing skills to foster other children and also get involved in homeless projects and all sorts of stuff. A very loving and wise lady. So I do hope you enjoy this conversation. So welcome, Kristen. Great to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Lovely to be talking to you.
And really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives on this topic. And just to give us a little bit of context, would you mind sharing with us a little bit about your background and whether you've not had a biological child due to circumstances or whether it's been choice-driven?
I think initially, it's always been by circumstances, I think. I think when I actually got married when I was 19 and I swore I'd never get married until I was 30, so it turned out differently. So by about the age of 23, we were sort of trying to get pregnant, and I got involved in IVF, which was very early on in those days, and so it was quite archaic, the procedures. So basically, we were on and off and lost some babies along the way, and I think we were on and off, so we're probably on and off the program for over 20 years.
Wow.
And then when I reached 40, I thought, okay, this is my last chance. And of course, as you age, there was no reason why we couldn't have children.
Yeah.
But then, of course, as you age, you're adding ageing factors into that, so it becomes more difficult. Look, we had some fabulous medical treatment and opportunities along the way. I'm not sure whether I would put myself at some of the risks nowadays, but it's absolutely been streamlined now. So it impacts on your life, but not as much as it did in those days.
So, Kristen, wow, 20 years, that's a long time to be going through that process with IVF. Was it inexplicable infertility? Like, I know often people say that doctors, they can't find any reason in particular why it's not happening. It's just one of those unexplainable things.
That was exactly what it was, and then even taken into account aging and some of the difficulties as the body gets older, there still wasn't any reason. So at 40, I said, right, this is make or break. I need to just know that at the end of this journey, I've done everything that was humanly possible. And so I went full bore for 5 years. I was working full time, so that was just all in secret for those 5 years. By that stage, we weren't sharing with anybody when we were going on the program. So I think I was well and truly involved for over 20 cycles and even adopted a couple of embryos. And so at the end of that time, it was very much a decision of, well, I've done everything. There was a medical emergency as a result of the treatment at that time. And so for me, it was, well, that's it now. I've done that. But along the way, from the age of 20, I'd actually been fostering adolescents just through the work and the voluntary work that I was doing. So I sort of had this role of being a mum throughout all of that time. So for over 20 years, that's what I did.
Wow, that's so interesting. And so really you were, yeah, extending those mothering and nurturing qualities to children in that way. And I guess that's not something you could have ever have foreseen, really. You just assumed at some point that you would have a child, I imagine, when you're going through that.
Absolutely. And I think with the adolescence, it was being in a situation with the voluntary work and also paid work at different times in the homelessness sector. It was being aware of needs. And for me, it didn't start out, it wasn't about, I want a mother, so I'll take in these teenagers, because believe me, they were homeless kids and very difficult at times.
Yeah.
But it was simply, I saw the need, and that's what I've always done, and tried to meet the need, and ran with it. And in doing so, ended up, in those days, the department didn't have a lot of options and would often throw kids at me. So ended up training people as caregivers, and then was involved in setting up a homelessness organisation that then went on to do much bigger things, not only for teenagers but also for families and single adults. So yeah, it was a long history, and it was sort of happening at the same time as trying to sort of make sense of something that didn't make sense for a long time.
And so what were some of the beliefs that brought up for you during that period? Did you go through a grieving process, or was that something that just came and went during that period?
I definitely, it's a grieving process. And I think even though for me, I'm very happy with my life, and whilst that would have been wonderful, I'm thinking also in a way I'm glad, which I can't believe I'd say that. I'm glad it didn't happen, because my life, I love what I'm investing in it. But as you do go on, I know there's still, when I don't think it's there is still some new griefs, because whilst I don't feel old, some of my girlfriends, they've got young women, they've got young daughters who are having babies. And so for me, it's like, okay, I didn't actually anticipate that I would grieve maybe not being a grandmother or having that sort of role. So it's really interesting. But along the way for me, when I couldn't make sense of it, initially it was to make sense of it by looking at, well, what's wrong with me? Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I don't deserve a child. Maybe my body's failed me. And so I felt a great sense that my body was failing me at one stage. And it really, with that treatment and the amount of years of moving in and out, and also having miscarriages, really had to keep a focus on life and not missing out on life as it was going through, and trying to keep some balance. Otherwise, you really can't survive in that, because it's almost like, well, life's on hold until this happens, and it does change your perceptions a lot if you're not careful.
Absolutely. And, some of the things that you mentioned there that come up to be explored are just so common, whereby we automatically then assume, well, there must be something wrong with me. Why is my body not doing what I want it to do? And it's just one of those inexplicable experiences that it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong or there's anything wrong with your body, actually. It's just behaving in the way it's behaving. And sometimes there just don't seem to be any rational, clear answers, do there?
No. And I know that certainly there is a sense of great distress and loss for those who do want to have babies and finding that for whatever reason.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But I did have my experience at the time was working with young people, and in the voluntary sense, it was a mission type youth group program attached to a church. So I was actually around people who had quite a culture in their society, the pressures and expectations. So trying to sort of get my head around what this means for me, I actually felt there was a lot of beliefs and assumptions around me that I often had to sort of try and work out, well, hang on a minute, this is actually about other people, because there was a cultural expectation that that's what you do. And it was almost at times a sense of children a currency, just the way things were worded in those times. If you don't have them, you're not as good as, your life is not as fulfilling. The terms that we use, childless, child-free, I think nowadays there's some classification called child-free.
Yeah.
But also words like barren comes up, I think.
I know. It's just, all of it's so derogatory, isn't it? And did you find then, obviously that was a long period of time where you were going through that, but did you find that you were on the receiving end of a lot of like inappropriate questioning? Especially, of course, you're not going to be sharing what you're going through with every man and his dog.
No. And so, no, there was absolutely the most inappropriate comments and commentary at times, and also felt quite the roles that I was involved in within that group were high profile at the time. So it was as though my situation was sort of common discussion fodder. So it was a really tricky thing. I think nowadays we have progressed in a sense of some of the questioning. Although I think with the language, the lexicon we have around whether you're children or not, or whether you're single or not, they're real concerns. The questions, I can remember being in a supermarket one day, and there was this really long queue, and the checkout girl was talking to somebody and said something about children. And then at the time I was also going through IVF, but I couldn't say anything, and I had had a miscarriage not long before that cycle. And she looked at me and said, oh, but you do want children, don't you? And I said, wow, in front of this whole queue of people, I said, wow, that's a rather personal question. And she said, do you think? And I said, yes. And I think from that point on, I actually was determined to just be really clear about boundaries and not to explain or justify, because I think when we do that, we give people the option, is that good enough or not? And particularly where I was reading something recently that's been written about the benefits of not having children. Well, every article on that I've read, it's about all these sort of amusing, fun things you could do that sound really shallow.
Yeah.
And yet we're opening ourselves up for people to say, okay, is that good enough or not? And of course, it's never going to be. We lose our power when we give someone that much right to comment on our life.
Absolutely. And you're right. There are a lot of posts whereby sometimes it can come across extremely flippantly. And in all honesty, that's not the reality for most people. And our lives are much more complex, and we have so many different types of responsibilities than whether or not, we have a child or we don't have a child. And often there is, though, an assumption that if you don't have children, then you've not got as many responsibilities. And often it's just different responsibilities.
That's right.
So we can't make that assumption. And it's interesting. I think slowly the conversation will change and is changing, but we need to just have more of them and be, as you say, much clearer on our boundaries and much more direct. And I can think of so many situations in my own life where I've had completely inappropriate questioning, and when I just had a miscarriage, and people who don't know you, and often they think they're just making conversation and small talk. And in actual fact, it's not small talk at all. No. It's big talk, and it's very personal, and you don't know what that person's been going through. So I think unless they bring it up, best not to ask, really. Let people raise it. If they want to talk about their children, great, that's fine. But I would never pry into that because I know how complex it is.
Absolutely. I was looking at the language that we use, and as I mentioned, the childless and child-free. It's talking as though women who don't have children, for whatever reason, as though they're a minority, and they're not. And in a sense, I can't live. I don't have to be a mother I don't have to give birth to necessarily be a mother or be able to mother.
Yeah.
But how can I live in my community and my family and be childless or child-free. I'm surrounded by children.
Exactly. And, you raise a good point. There's a writer, Melanie Notkin, who's based in New York, and she wrote Savvy Auntie and Otherhood, and she can't stand either of those terms. And she uses the term child full because she says her life is full of children, but they're just not hers. And I thought, that's a much more positive outlook. But also it seems to be, with both of those words, I'm not a huge fan of either of them. I suppose I would lean more towards child-free because I don't like the implication of childless, that you're less or you're lacking in some way. But what I've experienced is that childless seems to be used more by women who really wanted a child and then it's not happened for whatever reason. And child-free seems to be, it's more when people have chosen that very consciously and they're very clear about it. But it seems to also vary from country to country and culture. So there are slight variances in that as well, because I know some people, they feel the same about either. They would identify with either, whereas for me, they feel quite different.
Yes. Oh, very much so. Very much so. It's interesting when you're talking about the differences overseas, different countries. We also have, it's almost, I'm really shying away from that classification.
Yeah.
Very much because it's that sense of we define people by a certain criteria, and that if you've come from Queensland and you come to Melbourne, often people will say the first question that you're asked in Melbourne is, "What school did you go to?"
Oh, really?
Yes. We would say, if we're introducing someone, this is so and so. They are, and you'll talk about their title. We ask people, do you have children? Really, you look at France, they would actually introduce someone as, you would really love to meet this person. Her passion is, gardening or art. So they have a different focus altogether. I would really like that we change our language, that ask questions that help define or clarify a little bit of information, that we're looking at in questions like who's important in your life, who or what is meaningful in your life, so that a person then can define what's of value and who's of value and how their life is filled, without us just going, okay, we'll run through the list.
Yeah, the checklist of categories.
Did you have children? Do you don't have children? Da-da-da-da. It's like, really? Is that our starting point?
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. And just actually through doing these podcast interviews, I've really realised that I don't like using those words myself. I find they're really limited. And also, that was where the name Unclassified Woman came from, about not fitting into categories. But what I find is it's just that those search terms are very definitely used now, and people do use them to try and, research more of that area. But it's funny, I'm feeling increasingly that I want to get rid of them altogether and think we'll just refer to people as women. Every woman needs to define for herself what being a woman means to her, and womanhood does not equal motherhood, for everybody. It can't. And so it's really about looking at this from a much bigger perspective, I feel, that's much more compassionate and tolerant.
Yes. And I think being a mother, in a sense, there is so much about that is how it's used in society. It really is, we're talking about a role. And it's interesting because I think I was trying to look at, okay, if I were to come up with a major benefit of not having children, because this seems to be what a lot of articles are about, listing the benefits, I'd say, well, maybe I've been able to invest in my life and invest in my sense of self and my creativity. And if mothering in that role, that can actually be incorporated into many roles that I play organically and paid, voluntary, whatever we need to do. A lot of my work as a psychologist is women who they'll never not be a mum when they've got adult children, but their roles change and they'll come to their late 40s, 50s and start saying, well, I've lost myself. Who am I? That's not a role that I need to invest as much energy in meeting some of those needs. The children are independent. Yes, I love them and we're part of a family, but I am more than being a mum.
Yeah.
But yes, while we recognise that and acknowledge it, when it applies to women who don't have children, we sort of forget that whole point that it is just one aspect that may or may not be there, and it may be because of choice, and that's what it is, or it's something that's out of your control.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that you say that, yeah, of course, so many women later on then when their children have grown up, they go through that empty nester syndrome because obviously so much of their focus has been on raising their family, and then all of a sudden they've got this additional time back to themselves to think more about, okay, well, what do I want to focus on for, potentially the next 20 or 30 years?
Yes, and there is a grief for a lot that will use the term, they feel like they've settled for less because in their sacrifices that for a lot of them they felt at different times they didn't even have a choice around it. They felt they'd lost themselves and that they'd been a mother and also invested in other areas of themselves, which and I think that's where words often are raised around selfless and selfish, talking about motherhood. But in a sense, it's actually self-care and self-respect. And if you are investing in yourself, then if you have children and you're part of a family and community, everybody benefits. But that's got to be the starting point, not, okay, everyone else and the children's needs come first. It's not selfishness, it's self-care and self-respect.
Absolutely. And if you're not looking after you and you're not at an optimum level, then you're not going to be of any use to anyone else, especially not your family. And also it's about, I guess, particularly for daughters as well, it's really role modeling that self-care. And I know some of my own friends who we all know examples of some people who seem to be completely immersed once they become a mother. They've got so much to juggle that they do feel like they've lost themselves in that, especially in the younger years when, sleep deprivation and they're trying to do a million things, which is totally understandable. But then I've got other friends who have got such good boundaries and they are very good even at just having a short block of time to themselves. Having childcare, even if it's like 1 day or 2 days, so that they can just literally go for a walk for half an hour. And those friends that I see, that really have been very strict about enforcing that for their own sanity, to me, they seem to be the ones then that are much happier and much more present when they're with the children. I really believe that the demographic of women as well who don't have their own children have got that role to play where, as you've mentioned, we can be more supportive to our friends and family in our lives that have got children and try and support them in other ways. And so many women I know who've not got their own children still manage to support children in other forms, like with the fostering that you've done. And also I've got some friends who they sponsor the education of 13 children in Nepal, and they contribute regularly to their welfare and everything, and they're very involved in that at an orphanage. So that, there are some people who are doing amazing work supporting the community in other ways.
Very much so. I had the absolute privilege. My sister had her son later in life. My brother's children are around the age of 30 now. But with my sister's little boy, I was able to change my work from full-time to part-time, and she had to go back to work early on. So, for that first year of his life, he was with me one day a week, and just the privilege of being involved with that. That family it's everybody cares, and mothers, and it was just such a privilege, and to be also a stepmother to adult children, and hopefully if they have babies, to play that role without that sense of there needed to be more. Like I'm loving the more as it is.
Yeah, and that's just a perfect example, isn't it, of that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And in that way, we've sort of lost our sense of community in so many ways. in the olden days, I guess people often lived with their grandparents as well, and they were much more together as a family unit. People weren't as mobile, moving around the globe as frequently and easily with the advancement of technology as well. It's amazing how we can be in contact via technology, like instantaneously with friends and family around the world, but then often we're really lacking that in-person connection.
Yes, yes, that isolation that comes.
Yeah.
It's interesting because a lot of clients I've worked with, they one of the griefs for them when they do have children is the dislocation for a whole range of reasons of family life, and that they don't have grandparents who are alive or available, and they don't even have a community where, you know, the older couple in the neighbourhood could have been additional grandparents, but there's been such an isolation and disconnection. I think sometimes as women, we sort of, I guess sometimes with insecurities, those who have and those who don't, that can be seen as a bit of a currency, and so we're not great in supporting each other. But the fact is, we're women, and it's that we're all mother. You don't have to give birth to be a mother, and it is about saying, okay, how do we actually do this more respectfully?
Absolutely. And you're right, we're not a minority at all. I mean, it's a rapidly growing demographic. So now, I mean, women aged 40 and over, that's 25% of the population. And obviously it varies slightly, but that figure's doubled in the last 10 years. And in the United States currently, nearly 50% of women of a childbearing age, so that's, I guess, from, you know, the late teens onwards, don't have children. And there's, you know, you think, well, that's nearly half the population. And that's certainly not reflected in the way things are depicted in the media and our society and interactions and stuff. So it's quite fascinating, really.
And look, yeah, you're right. And I think it's interesting within my my practice, the last 5 years, what I've noticed is a dramatic increase in women, late 30s, 40s, who have wanted to have children. They've been in long-standing relationships. There's a breakdown of relationships. And for them, it's looking at, well, I've done all the things I wanted to do. I've lived my life. I sort of assumed that would happen, but for circumstances outside of their control, relationship ends, and they're in a position of, well, do I actually go to an IVF donor sperm? Do I? What's the choices? Do I be a single mum? Because by the time you meet somebody else, and that's an investment of meeting someone, trust, a relationship, women do have a very small window of opportunity, whereas for men, they actually can be having babies at whatever age they are. And so I've seen an increase in very disenfranchised young women who are feeling very isolated in their late 30s and moving on, that's absolutely what they want. Most of them are perfectly healthy, and no reason to think that there would be, that all of them would have medical issues. But it's simply, what do we do? Because yes, men are knowing they've got more choices and they don't have to actually operate within a period of time. And I think this is going to be the next issue, that in terms of statistics, well, I think it's a majority, not a minority, of women finding, well, there's a whole range of new societal reasons why we actually aren't having babies.
Absolutely. There's so many reasons. And like you mentioned as well, if you've been in a long-term relationship, met somebody when you were younger or in your 20s, and then that's come to an end, and if you're thinking you would like to have a family, then there's very limited time. And I'm hearing this all the time now, actually. So many women are happy to meet their partner, but they're actually meeting them later and settling down later. And so by the time that comes around, late 30s, early 40s or later, that person may already have children and they don't want to have any more, or they might be clear that they've got to a point in their life and they don't want children, full stop, but they're happy to be in the relationship. And so then it's a completely different dynamic, and it's interesting. I'm hearing this more and more. Yes, I've had two conversations actually in the last few days with two people saying the same thing. They didn't meet their husbands till they were 40. And so then at that point, and also they were very conscious of the fact that they wanted to have that time to really deepen the relationship and not rush straight into thinking about, should we try and get pregnant when they've only just met that person? And it's not something that people always feel like raising immediately.
No, there's so many new pressures around that very issue. And there's in a sense, the anxiety levels are so high because it's as though, well, when we do take our time, we're running the risk that 3 years in, we might find, no, the relationship doesn't proceed. So then I've lost another 3 years as an opportunity to talk family. And, as I mentioned, I think the last 5 years or so, and particularly the last couple of years, I've just had such an increase in this being a serious issue for women.
Yeah. And also as well, for people who are ambivalent about having a child and they're not sure that that's what they want. Another thing, and I experienced this myself a few years ago, one guy that I was dating, he just assumed that I was desperate for a child. It's like, you've got to 40 now. You're obviously desperate to have a child, and I've already got two. I'm not sure that I want any more. And I was like, hang on a minute. But it was just the assumption, and that's not unusual either. Mm-hmm. So I remember having some quite heated conversations, but he didn't really believe me.
Yeah,
that didn't last very long, as you can imagine. But but it was interesting. I was really taken aback by that, and I thought, well, no, that's not really the case. But it's interesting that you've got that perspective, and that's how you feel about women that you're meeting around the 40-year-old age mark. You're assuming that they're all desperate to have a child.
It's those assumptions about women.
Yeah.
And in that situations, yes, it's men and society, but I think other women too, depending on their own experiences. There's so many assumptions and beliefs and expectations about other women.
There really are. There really are.
It's really tricky to buy into that and to constantly think, okay, it's not about what they think. That may be their perception, that's their issue, but it's what I need and what I think that's important. And particularly, as I mentioned earlier, not having to explain. I think the minute we start opening that up, the more we do, the more we're trapped in a conversation where we've just given them all the power to say, is that good enough or not? Or even to comment if when women decide, look, I don't know whether I want a baby, or I know really clearly that I don't, it's not for me. It's then end of story and let's move on. Topic's closed. You don't need to feel like, oh, okay, I've got to just lie here under the microscope while people try and just dissect that and get their head around it.
And also, even if you are really clear that that's not what you want, you don't necessarily want to discuss that with somebody. Sometimes it's just inappropriate timing, the situation's not right, or, you think, oh, I just haven't got time to go into this, and I just don't really want to discuss it, actually.
Yes, and I think when you notice, if that's what you notice, that is, you have an initial response like that, that means you are being invited to explain and justify. And so even when you notice, oh, I've got to go into, it's like, hang on, no, I don't. I'm not going to. I've practiced at some stage, went through a period where I was practicing saying to people, no, I don't. And then when they wanted to take it further, I said, look, that's actually an issue I'm not prepared to discuss. And working out ways that I could actually say, this is a boundary here. And the message, you don't cross it. It's not open for discussion.
Yeah, and it's funny, actually, I wrote a blog post on this exact topic, and it was ways to respond to that question.
Oh.
And it was funny. I mean, I had several suggestions in there of some that were also bringing in a bit of humour as well. Like, look, I'm just too busy practicing and I'm enjoying that stage too much at the moment to think about taking it further. And just, some kind of funny things like that of, my love making takes up way too much of my time. I wouldn't be able to, and obviously there were more serious responses because it's not a funny situation for some people, but it's really, I suppose, trying to adapt your response to the situation you're in. And if you can have some ready-made responses that are just short, sweet, to the point, and just, keeping very clear boundaries so that you don't open the door to have to engage in these like painful, eye-rolling conversations with people that shouldn't really be, it's not really any of their business at the end of the day.
That's right. And I think you're right in having some responses ready so you can think, okay, if the worst, what's the fear that they'll ask this or say this? Okay, then what's the worst that could happen? Okay, what would I say? Practice it, then put it away so that you've got a comment to make. Otherwise, you can actually find you then start avoiding situations, and particularly family get-togethers or whatever community group, or whether it's sport or whatever groups you're involved with, you can start avoiding for fear of if and when that question will be asked.
And also, I think as well, it's good to practice these things because often people can come across as being extremely defensive, and then that can turn it into, an even bigger discussion. So you just want to try and be as neutral as possible. What these conversations really demonstrate is that there is no black and white. Every person's situation is unique to them. There's so many different factors and challenges and perspectives. And again, these things all change in our 20s, 30s and 40s. It's just something that's so complex.
Yes, very much so. And I think certainly there's so many issues that it impacts on in our way of thinking and being, but it is such a personal issue because it is about your body.
Yes.
And what it does or doesn't do, will or won't do. And so that's where I think it needs to be personal, and there's just the respect around that. And as you've been speaking to, the respect comes through in the language, perceptions, and basically continuing to get these people's stories out there and to share and to open up new dialogues that are helpful, not just for women in general.
But also young women, I feel, because I don't know about you, but when I was a young girl growing up, in a Catholic family with a lot of Irish in the family, it was just, I wasn't even aware that it was something that was an option to not choose to have children. And even though I had quite a reaction to the assumption that's exactly what I do, I had a reaction to that from quite young, thinking, well, hang on a minute. And I did used to say, well, what if I don't do that? Or well, what if that's not what happens to me? So there was, even at that young age, I thought, I'm not sure about that. But I know that I didn't really have any role models around me who didn't have children. Everybody was sort of doing the same thing, really. And even now in my family, with all my cousins and stuff like that, I'm the only one who's not got children. So it's interesting. So I think it's really important to role model to young women as well about really following what's true for them. And if that feels right for them and that's what they want to pursue, great. Yes. But not everybody does feel the same, and everyone's here for a different reason. Everybody's got different purposes, different paths to follow. We've all got different gifts and different ways of sharing ourselves and expressing ourselves in the world.
Very much so. And if you are in a situation, when people are in a situation where they're really wanting children, or they're the one who's decided they don't want them, and the majority of their social network is couples who have children, then it's looking at, okay, I actually have some gaps in my life of balancing out where I invest my time and with whom, so that there is more than being around thinking, well, who actually does understand? Because there are so many other people outside.
There really are.
Or just to change the perception, because sometimes you can come away thinking it's just me, and it can be really lonely.
It can, and I was just thinking then of, in the UK, there's Dr. Chloe Peacock, and she set up the League of Fabulous Women, and that's a friendship and networking group for women because she got into her 30s, all her friends were having children. She knew that she didn't want to do that, but she said, obviously all of her friends were then making new friends with new mums, and they were very caught up in that community. And she started thinking, wow, I really need to make some new friends who were in a similar situation to me. And so she couldn't really find anything. So she organised a meetup group, and very rapidly that has become nationwide. And she was gobsmacked at how quickly that grew. And they have all sorts of events and meetups and things happening all over the UK, and it's really grown. And just, she said it's been amazing. They've made so many new friendships. So many women have been introduced to each other who are doing all sorts of, great things. They might be working together. All sorts of different friendships and connections have been formed.
And we need more of that.
Yeah.
More of that.
So it's great to know that there are these communities out there and that are on the increase, and that's only going to increase further. And then what's probably going to happen is there's probably going to be further niching within those groups.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. But, well, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today, Kristen. And would you like to share where people can find you online and more about your work as a psychologist, a counsellor, a coach as well, and all the work that you're doing?
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle, for having me today. It's been wonderful. It's actually the first time I've spoken publicly. And so, yes, it's only been in the last year or so that I had thought, you know what, I actually feel more comfortable. And I think there's a forum that I've missed in lots of ways. My experience was very different. It started quite a while ago. So to have this opportunity has been, a real milestone for me. I have a practice in Collins Street in Melbourne, and as mentioned, a psychology practice, and also I do coaching. And it basically is for men and women who at times get stuck, but also what I'm noticing is just when I say stuck, that can be with lots of issues of depression, anxiety, all of those issues. But I'm also working with a lot of women who are reaching points in their life where they have settled for whatever reason, or there's been a sort of an end date or use by date for their goals and plans, and looking at what next. My website is www.KristenBarnes.com.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today.
It's been a real privilege, and thank you very much for the opportunity, Michelle, and I love what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Unclassified Woman. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. For information on events and services, connect with Michelle at michellemariemcgrath.com.